Okay. So we are officially open. And good afternoon to all of you coming into our afternoon webinar. We're going to pause for just a few seconds to give people some time to get in before we get started. And once we see that most of you are in, we will start the show. And if anybody hears antique clocks going off, I have done my best to silence them, but Saturday is winding day. Hey, Rocky, it looks like we're holding steady.
Looks pretty, yeah, stand stop the room.
Well, I think it's the lovely weather that people are experiencing, and I can't blame them. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully a few more people will come in. But good afternoon, and welcome to the Spring Gardening Webinar Series presented by the Central Oregon Master Gardeners, Oregon State University, and our sponsors. And thank you for joining us on this absolutely beautiful Earth Day. I can't blame anybody for wanting to be outside, but if you're inside and watching this webinar, you are in for a treat today. My name is Vicki Miner, and I will be your host. And Rocky Bassett is another master gardener who is helping along the sides there. Our presenter is Gail Langellotto, who will talk about good bugs and the bad bugs in our gardens. Today's session closes out our spring gardening webinar series. And so we are grateful to all of you who have participated. And this afternoon's session covers Central Oregon insects and which ones are a gardener's best friend and which ones can cause harm to Oregon's farms, gardens, and natural resources. This presentation is being recorded and will be available online for a short period of time following the session. Those emails generally go out the week after, so Monday or Tuesday of next week. So you will get an email with a link to the session. And before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping matters. All of your microphones and your videos have been turned off so that we can focus on our speaker. If you wish to ask a question, there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And when you click on that, you can type a question in, and all of the attendees would be able to see your question. And if you happen to have the same question, you can upvote it by clicking on the hand that's next to that particular question. Also, don't scribble notes down when Gail refers to a link. There's no need to do that because we are going to be sending you all of the links that she refers to in the email that we send after the session. Okay. So let me introduce Miss Gail to you. Gail is a professor who all of the master gardeners have known for a long time, and we know her and love her. She's a professor of horticulture at OSU, where she also serves as the principal investigator for the OSU Garden Ecology Lab, which is an amazing place. If you haven't gone online to see it, you got to go. She teaches courses in insect pest management and insect agroecology. I want to make sure I pronounce that correctly. And she coordinates OSU's Urban Agriculture Certificate Program. She has a master's and a PhD in entomology from the University of Maryland, and she completed her postdoctoral training at UC Davis. So what are you going to learn in this webinar? Well, she's going to talk about beneficial insects. She'll talk about how to attract them to your garden. You'll also learn about emerging pests, because we do have some of those coming in Oregon, and how to manage them in a way that does no harm to surrounding wildlife. The whole point of this discussion is how to build a garden that's beautiful and ecologically friendly. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to turn things over to Gail.
Thank you so much, Vicki, and thank you to all of you for being here today. I know that it's a gorgeous day outside, and so the fact that you're spending a few moments here with me learning about some of the insects that you might find in your own yard or garden means a lot to me. I do want to say a little bit about our lab group, the Garden Ecology Lab at Oregon State University, and encourage you when you receive the links that Vicki's going to send to take a look at our website. I really love the work that we're doing. Our entire research program is focused around trying to understand the ecology of garden habitats and empowering people to plan, plant, and maintain gardens that really help conserve the region's biodiversity and lend positive things to the ecosystem. And just a slide of many of the great folks that I get to work with. In the top left there, we have Mallory, Savea, and Devin doing bee counts on a study where we're comparing bee visitations to true wild-type native plants and cultivars derived from those native plants. In the bottom kind of second picture from the left is Gwen Murich. She's a landscape architect at University of Oregon, and we're doing a lot of studies trying to understand how gardeners having their hands in the soil actually affects your gut microbiome, your skin microbiome. And then just many great people that I get to work with studying native plants, pollinators, urban soils, containerized production of fruits and vegetables. So check us out if you have a moment. So I'm going to both start and end with the key points that I hope to get across today. Really, given the time we have together, I hope that I can convince you that insects are amazing. The more you learn about them, the more you'll become comfortable with them in the spaces that you share together. The vast majority of insects are beneficial or neutral to our existence. Very few of them relatively rise to the status of pest. You have the opportunity to build a garden that naturally resists pests, which will mean that you can cut back on your use of insecticides. Oftentimes, this means seeking out native plant species and finding a place for them in your garden habitat. If you do one thing, I would encourage you to pull back on your use of pesticides and in particular broad spectrum insecticides. The natural pest control that insects and other beneficial arthropods give is amazing. And then, when pest issues do occur, often it's because something is out of sync. That something that is out of sync may be because we have a non-native species in the habitat, whether it be a non-native plant species, which is more prone to insect pests, or a non-native insect species, which is able to prosper and live without its natural controls. And in general, when building and maintaining a garden, which is eco-friendly and naturally resists pests, I am a big advocate that if you have one particular plant or group of plants which has consistent pest problems, stop trying to win that battle. Instead, seek out alternatives that may be more pest prone. So I want to start with the idea that I am an entomologist and therefore I love almost all insects. There are a few that are on my naughty list, but most of them I absolutely adore. Really what I want to try to get across here is that whether or not an insect is good or bad really depends upon you and your perspective. So in at least some cases, we might be able to shift our perspective about certain insects and thus decrease the need or intention to use insecticides against them. In hoping to build the case to convince you, if you happen to be on the fence at this particular moment, that insects are awesome, I give to you these facts. We have about 1 million species of insect that have been discovered and described by scientists. And most entomologists think that there are about 5 to 8 million species of insect here on this globe, which means at best we've only discovered and described about 20% of all insect species. Vicky, I'm sorry, my dog is like barking madly to get in, and I need to take just one quick pause to let him in. I'm really sorry, folks.
Go and take care of the doggy. It's fine.
Okay, sorry everyone. I thought he was going to like knock down the back door, so I just had to take that quick pause. So in addition to being numerically important because of the sheer number of insect species that we have, they're also hold great importance because they represent about half of all animal biomass on Earth. And here on this slide, I just have a picture of beautiful chrysidid wasp to the left, beautiful beetles to the right, just trying to convince you they are gorgeous, they're awesome, and by their numerical importance, their numerical abundance alone, they are super important to us. Insects, if we count up all of the species that have been discovered and described by scientists on Earth, depending upon who you ask, insects represent about 50% of all species. On this particular pie chart, I used a high-end estimate of the importance of insect species richness. About 56% of all life on Earth is some type of insect. If we consider that insects are numerically abundant, both in species number and in their sheer biomass, I present to you that that is of great importance because we know that biodiversity has a direct link to ecosystem function. A particular hypothesis which is favored by many ecologists at this moment is called the rivet hypothesis, which suggests that insects or species are like rivets on an airplane. Each plays a small critical role in ecosystem function. And whereas most ecosystems are able to tolerate the loss of a few species, there's going to become a point in time where you pop out one too many rivet, you lose one too many species, and that ecosystem will no longer be able to function as it had before. So if we think about the fact that species are like rivets on a plane, which work all together to help an ecosystem function, when we consider that most of all life on Earth is some type of insect, they're important just for that basic fact alone. They help our ecosystem functions in ways which make our life better. We also derive direct economic benefit from insects. A survey that was done by May Spahn and John Losey way back in 2006 suggests that if we don't even include honeybees, which give a whole lot of value to our global economy, insects contribute $100 billion, which was an inflation adjusted number from the original article, to the global economy. Various insects help pollinate our crops, help us decompose waste, help with pest control, and also provide food for wildlife, fish, and game animals, all of which are important aspects of our global economy. And then I also offer to you that insects are amazing because they're just about everywhere, including in your own yard and garden, and that there are many wonderful ecological interactions that are happening likely just under our eyes, but we don't necessarily notice. This is a video taken by Mallory Mead of a leafcutter bee in one of our Clarkia field plots. I noticed that when looking at a list of bees, looking at a list of insects in Central Oregon, that leafcutter bees are actually listed as a potential insect that could be considered a pest. And yes, if you're planting wildflowers and there are bees that are harvesting the petals and taking them back to their nest, then perhaps that isn't something that you want. You're growing those flowers for their beauty, and here this bee is, how dare she cut up little pieces to take them away? But when I tell you that she is cutting those petals and taking them back to her nest so that she can literally wrap her babies in flower petals, hopefully it gives you a different perspective. That's a gorgeous ecological interaction, something we see quite regularly in garden systems. And if we just stop to notice that they're happening all around us, it gives us greater appreciation for the insects in our yards and gardens. Thanks to projects such as the Oregon Bee Atlas, I was able to look up whether or not this ecological interaction also occurs in Central Oregon. Most of our research occurs in the Willamette Valley in Western Oregon, and I could get a list of all of the different bee species that have been found in and around Bend and Redmond. And then I could look at all of the different leafcutter bees that are found in your region as well. And when I was scrolling through the different observations, I found this beautiful little leafcutter bee sitting on the edge of a Clarkia or farewell to spring petal, which suggests to me that these types of ecological interactions are happening all around you as well. So a lot of my research focuses on pollinating insects. Hopefully I don't have to convince you too much that pollinators are awesome. They do so many wonderful things. They're very beautiful. I do want to take a moment to talk about those insects that give us free pest control in the garden, because some of them people don't necessarily like. I found that in general, folks are rarely spider neutral. You either love spiders or you dislike spiders. And even if you don't give them much thought, most people react quite strongly one way or the other if there's a spider right in front of them. Here we have a very common Oregon spider, the zebra jumping spider. They are in Central Oregon as well. I absolutely love them. Look at the beautiful eyes on that spider and how cute and furry they are. They also have these very elaborate mating dances they do for each other when it is time for them to mate. One thing about spiders is that there is no such thing as an herbivorous spider. All of them prey on smaller insects or other smaller spiders. They are real great allies for natural pest control in the garden. This black and yellow garden spider, the golden argiope, I love this beautiful, beautiful spider. They make these big, gorgeous orb webs that if you're hiking in the woods and you happen to come across one, perhaps they're not your favorite thing to walk through, but looking at this gorgeous specimen, in the top right photo, we have the female to the left and the smaller male to the right. They're just really beautiful to behold. Once again, fantastic free pest control in the garden. One note, that extra fuzzy area in the middle of the web is called a stabilimentum. Scientists think that that's actually a way that the spiders can telegraph to birds, like, don't fly through here, don't take down my web when you're flying through the forest. Wolf spiders are also another common spider across Oregon. I absolutely love these spiders as well. You may have noticed them walking around your garden or yard and have seen this little egg sac towards the end of their abdomen. You can see that on the left-hand photo. On the top right-hand photo, that's actually a female whose egg sac has hatched and all of the little babies have climbed onto her abdomen. That mother spider will actually give maternal care to her babies for at least a few days, making sure they get the moisture, the water that they need before they jump off her back and make their way into the world. And I have a picture of the spider's gorgeous eyes on here because if you're interested in spider ID, looking at their web shape for those spiders that build a web or looking at their eye arrangement for spiders that don't build webs is one way to start honing in on what type of spider you're looking at. I also want to give bugs their due. There are many predaceous bugs that are common in garden and farm habitats, particularly those garden or farm habitats that pull back on broad spectrum insecticides. Things like assassin bugs, big-eyed bugs, so named because they have these two large eyes on each lateral side of their head, or minute pirate bugs. And here I just have various stages of nymphs and then the fully winged adult. These are all fantastic beneficial insects which feed on aphids and whiteflies and thrips and spider mites, fantastic generalist predators that help us with free pest control in the garden. Syrphid flies are another beneficial that we have in the garden, and not only do they help with pest control as larvae, but the adults are beneficial pollinators in the garden. We can identify syrphid flies in the garden and differentiate them from bees. Sometimes people see the black and yellow coloring and they mistake them as being bees. But if you look at their head, you'll see that they have very large eyes, much bigger than a bee's. And then the key giveaway is that they have these stubby little antennae at the front of their face, whereas bees have much longer antennae at the front of their face. That's one way to help differentiate them. When they're adults, they sip on nectar, they help pollinate flowers, they're absolutely beautiful. They make me feel better if I ever let my lettuce go to seed. If it gets too warm and my lettuce bolts, I always get like a little congregation of syrphid flies visiting those flowers. Not only are syrphid fly adults beneficial as pollinators, but the larvae, of which I have a photo of one right here in the bottom left, are beneficial predators in the garden. One thing that when folks are looking at the larvae of insects, it can be kind of difficult to identify what you're looking at. Are you looking at a caterpillar? Are you looking at a beetle larvae? Are you looking at some other type of larvae? Well, if you're looking at a syrphid fly larvae, you have to remember that the larvae of flies are maggots, unremarkable maggots that are just little blobs that have no true legs, just kind of like little tubular blobs that feed on a lot of aphids, whiteflies, thrips, and other insects that may not be your favorite in the garden. We can differentiate that with other type of insect larvae, such as a sawfly. We can see that this sawfly has 3 pair of true legs, marking it as differentiated from this syrphid fly larvae right here. I want to talk a little bit about ladybugs, which are also beneficial predators in the garden. And even though most people know intuitively what a ladybug beetle adult looks like, very few people by comparison know what the other life stages of this important and valuable insect can look like. Here I have photos of what ladybug eggs look like in the top right. These little golden, yolky looking eggs laid all in a pile. I have several pictures of ladybug larvae, which are the legged creatures that to me always look like little dragons that are super efficient hunters and predators of aphids and other pests in the garden. When ladybugs start to pupate and transition towards the adult phase, they have this hard covering over their bodies, their pupal cases, which may look a little bit odd. But if you're able to recognize these different life stages of beneficial insects in the garden, you'll be more likely to tolerate them or actively conserve them and ultimately help to build an eco-friendly garden, which is full of natural pest control. I do want to say something about non-native ladybug beetles, as well as ladybug beetles available for purchase. Because ladybug beetles are such efficient predators of pest insects such as aphids, whiteflies, thrips, spider mites, For several years, there was a movement to import non-native species to establish them here in the United States so that they could help with pest control. One of the species that has been imported over time is Harmonia axaridis, the Asian ladybird beetle. This beetle tends to be relatively larger than our native species. It can be really difficult to identify because there are more than 20 color morphs of this particular species of ladybird beetle, 16 of which I have pictured here. Oftentimes it can be difficult because of the vast color polymorphism in this particular species to distinguish it from native species, but the relative size of Harmonia axaridis compared to our native species is one way that you can start to tell the difference. Harmonia is much bigger than native species. You know, you can go and buy and purchase lady beetles to release into your garden. The species which is most commonly sold is Hippodamia convergens, the convergent ladybird beetle. I think it's called Hippodamia convergens because of like those nice curly cues it has on its thoracic hood, those little white curly cues on the black thoracic hood. This actually is a native species, but one of the reasons that it's become so popular for sale in garden and farm stores is because each fall, this species gathers in mass aggregations on hillsides, in forests, in people's houses. Sometimes they can be a pest in people's houses when they gather in high numbers. So it's really easy for folks that want to sell this species to gather them up in high numbers, package them in these packets, ship them off to home and garden stores so that you can buy them and release them in your garden. Well, there are a couple of issues with this particular practice. Number one, by the time you actually purchase them from a home and garden store, many of them are going to be dead. You're going to be purchasing a bunch of ladybird beetles, half of which are probably going to be dead before you release them into your garden. But the second major issue with buying and releasing ladybird beetles is that ladybird beetles have this behavior where they have to go through a long distance migration before they begin to lay eggs. So what you want is to create a system where you have the natural reproduction of beneficial insects in your garden system or near your garden system. Well, this particular species is pre-programmed physiologically to need to fly several tens of miles before it's even going to lay eggs anywhere. So once you release them into your garden system, if they do happen to be alive, they're pre-programmed to take off pretty quickly after release. So you're going to get nearly no to absolutely no benefit from buying and releasing ladybug beetles into your garden system. And then the third issue with buying and releasing ladybugs, whether they're native species, occasionally, but very, very rarely will you find non-native species for sale, is that ecologists think that this practice has contributed to the local and regional decline of native ladybug species. And this observation has given rise to what's known as the Lost Ladybug Project. It's a community science project out of Cornell University that asks folks to take photos of the ladybugs within their local system, share them with researchers at Cornell so that they can start to understand what native ladybug species are actually left here in the United States. You know, this project actually has a relatively local connection. Way back in 2009, Kate Yates was doing homeschooling lessons with her 6-year-old daughter, Allison, and they decided as part of this homeschooling effort to participate in the Lost Ladybird Project. And Kate and Allison actually took a photo of they took a photo of the transverse ladybug, which is the second rarest ladybug in the United States. All of this happened in Lakeview, Oregon, not too far from where we are, relatively speaking. The lead principal investigator of that study, John Losey, actually flew out to Lakeview to look for other transverse ladybugs in and around that area. And together they found the 9-spotted ladybug, the rarest ladybug in the United States, in someone's backyard in Lakeview, Oregon. And this is one of the things that I think is so fantastic about being a gardener that cues in on the insects that are around you. There are discoveries waiting to be made all over, including in your own community or backyard garden. Some other friends in the garden include ground beetles, these black, bronze, or metallic green beetles, which have these strong ridges on their back. These are fantastic for helping to keep down any ground foraging pest, whether they be synphylins, whether they be root feeding insects, whether they be any other type of pest that may be more on the ground of the garden more so than on the foliage. A particular type of ground beetle that I absolutely love is the tiger beetle. They're so beautiful. They're very abundant in Western Oregon because they really, in Central Oregon because they really like hotter, drier habitats. I find them often when I'm hiking in portions of Central Oregon that are more exposed, the hot lava bed trails, for example. These beetles have really tall, skinny legs, and they actually like raise and lower their legs to like release heat from their body. Really quick predators. One of the reasons I love them is if you look at this face, that face is just gorgeous. And look at those toothed mandibles that they use to capture and consume their prey. Other beneficial insects in the garden include our lacewings, which are relatively soft-bodied insects. As adults, they have these gorgeous wings that are full of veins. That's part of the reason that they're called the lace wings, is because they have lacy-like wings all over that they hold over the back of their body. They tend to be green. Sometimes they can be more coppery in color. But once again, when we're talking about beneficial insects in the garden and the free pest control that they give to us, I want to emphasize that for the most part, it is going to be the immature stages of those insects rather than the adults, which are going to be your best pest control friend. Here on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the larvae of a green lacewing. They tend to be brown and cream or gray and cream, and you can see these gorgeous, gorgeous mandibles projecting forward, ready to capture and consume prey. Now, one of the reasons why the larval insects are so much better than the adults at capturing and consuming prey is because when you're a youth insect, your entire job is to eat and eat a lot so that you can grow up to be a reproductive adult. Once an insect switches over to the adult stage, so much of their behavior switches from eating to reproduction. They want to find a mate. They need to mate. They need to find a place to lay eggs. And all of that time and energy going towards reproduction really takes away time and energy that instead could go towards consumption. So on the whole order of things, the larval forms of these beneficial predators are going to eat more, consume more, and help you more with natural pest control compared to their adult counterparts. Now, the larval forms of predatory insects eat and eat a lot, which means that cannibalism can be a particular problem. If you pack them all up together, they're going to eat each other. That's another reason why I really don't recommend buying and releasing these animals into your garden. Instead, I really want to encourage you to build and maintain a garden that will naturally provide good habitat for these insects. It's really easy for you to do that. You plant plants which have flowers, which offer nectar and pollen. It's not too difficult to convince a gardener to do that. But absolutely essential is you do need to pull back on your use of insecticides, and in particular broad spectrum insecticides, because if you're using insecticides to beat down insect pests, you're also going to be beating down these beneficials. And when you do that, it makes it that much harder for them to reestablish in your garden. As I said, they're very cannibalistic. Some people have asked me in the past, can I just buy the juvenile forms of these insects if it is the juveniles and not the adults, which do most of the pest control efforts in a garden? And you can, but it's really expensive. What I have right here is a cardboard container on the top left and the top right, where each of those little triangular cells is filled with a ladybug larvae or a lacewing larvae. So if you are, say for instance, a greenhouse grower that is growing a high value specialty crop, and you have a problem with like mites or aphids or some other greenhouse pest, then maybe it will be worth your money to purchase the larval forms of beneficial insects such as ladybugs or lacewings. But if you're a gardener, it is pretty much going to be prohibitively expensive, because in order to buy the larval forms of these insects, basically what you're buying is someone's time that is individually using tweezers to pick up these larval insects and put one in each of those triangular cells. Super, super expensive, super, super time consuming. You can also buy lacewings where they will put the eggs of lacewings in these little Dixie cups that are filled with like rice or wheat hulls. Those are somewhat less expensive, but if you do that, be aware that species ID is not always great in the biological control industry. There have been instances where folks have thought that they were buying one species, but when taxonomists actually rear them out, they find out it was another species. But more from a practical point of view of the home gardener, if you buy a Dixie cup full of like 100 lacewing eggs, then as soon as those eggs start to hatch out in that little Dixie cup, what you have is a case of king of the mountain. The first larvae that hatches out is going to sit at the top of that cup and wait for all of the others to hatch out so that they can cannibalize them in the cup itself. So if you do happen to buy lacewing eggs, taking time to scatter them throughout the garden in places where they're not going to dry out is something which is going to be important for getting the true pest control power of what you're trying to purchase. Once again, I'm a big advocate, instead of buy and release, of learning to identify the beneficial insects that you have in your own yard and garden and doing what you can to conserve them. Most people know what the adults of beneficial insects look like, such as this adult lacewing. Fewer people know what the larval forms look like, but hopefully you're becoming more familiar with it through practice and through exposure. To me, the larvae of green lacewings always look like little alligators or crocodiles. They're always brown and cream or gray and cream. But then even learning to understand what the beautiful eggs of this group of insects look like, just one gorgeous little silken thread with a little pearl egg at the very top. If you see this in the garden, that's a great sign that you have natural pest control going on all around you. I also want to talk a little bit about parasitic insects, parasitoid wasps, most of which are incredibly small and are likely going to escape your attention unless you're actively looking for these gorgeous insects in the garden. Once again, pulling back on insecticide use will help them to establish and thrive in your local habitat. Some of the most common insects that we find, parasitoid wasps that we find in gardens, are the aphelenids, which prey on aphids. What they do is they lay a single egg within one aphid. And when that egg hatches out, it slowly starts consuming the aphid from the inside out. And then eventually it will metamorphosize into an adult wasp, where it will need to cut a little porthole out towards the end of the aphid abdomen so that it can fly off and start stabbing more aphids in the garden. If you see aphid mummies in your garden, either on this right-hand photo, I can see several aphids that are fat and swollen and soon will become aphid mummies if they're not aphid mummies already. If you see aphid mummies in your garden, once again, you need to pat yourself on the back because you have natural pest control going on, and it shows that you have a healthy garden habitat. You also can buy parasitoid wasps and place them into your garden. What they do is they actually take the cocoons of parasitoid wasps and they glue them on these little stock cards in what may be what I think is the most boring master's thesis on earth. Somebody ordered a bunch of these cards, looked at all of the cocoons under the microscope and scored them as being alive or dead, high quality or low quality. And research has shown that most of what you buy arrives to you dead. So why waste your money on it? Instead, make your garden habitat a naturally happy home for these insects, and you will have natural pest control going on in situ all year long. Well, maybe not all year long in Central Oregon because large parts of the year are too cold for much to be going on in terms of insect ecology. So I want to move on and talk a little bit about the bad bugs with a few caveats. First of all, I would like us to consider that sometimes the practices that we use in the gardens actually causes insects to go from non-nuisance to bad. In other instances, some things that we consider pests cause no real damage, so why bother with them? And then in other aspects, oftentimes we mislabel something as a pest because our insect ID skills are not all that great. We may confuse it with a superficial lookalike and try to target and spray an insect, which would really cause no harm. So first, I offer up aphids. And I do want you to consider the fact that a lot of insects can be kept in check with natural controls, particularly if we pull back on or eliminate pesticide use, which may seem like a little bit of a paradox. But consider the aphid and why aphids are so hated by many gardeners. Aphids are capable from going from a single aphid to an aphid outbreak in a rather short time period for a couple of reasons. First, aphids are capable of asexual reproduction, so they can start reproducing right away without ever having to go through the trouble of finding a mate and mating. Second, aphids are one of the few insects which give birth to live young. They don't lay eggs. They're able to mature the eggs inside of their abdomen and directly start pumping out asexual clones of themselves early in the spring. So here on the left-hand side of the slide, we have a mother aphid and we see the beauty of live aphid birth going on right there. And if you ever look at a little aphid aggregation in your garden and you see one big fat mama aphid surrounded by all of these little baby clones, that's pretty typical of what we see when we have live birth of aphid clones. I do want to offer that aphids themselves are relatively defenseless against their predators. And since they feed on the phloem of plants and phloem contains photosynthetic sugars, aphids are really nothing more than little sacks of sugar. They are incredibly delicious to a lot of other predators and parasitoids. I like to call them the Skittles of the insect world. In most cases, aphid problems would solve themselves if we're able to wait them out until the predators and parasitoids find them. If you have an aphid problem early in the spring or via monitoring your garden, if you notice aphids early in the spring, one of the things that I like to do is pop a couple of them to release the volatile chemicals that will actually help to attract and bring in the parasitoids and predators that will naturally help to keep those aphids down. Now, I know because aphids do have a high effective reproductive capacity, that there may be times when they explode in number to the point where you really can't tolerate them. But if there is an opportunity for tolerance, know that most aphid problems will take care of themselves. I've been talking a little bit about how I encourage you to pull back on the use of broad spectrum insecticides. This is to cut down on what's known as a secondary pest outbreak. A secondary pest outbreak is actually a pest outbreak that we cause via the application of pesticides. So here in this graph, I have a plot of the number of insect pests in the red plot and the number of predators and parasitoids in the black plot. What oftentimes happens when we apply a pesticide is that we locally knock down both the number of pests and the number of predators and parasitoids. But consider the fact that most predators are significantly larger than their prey. So that's why I have all of those photos of predators and aphids at the top right hand of the slide. It's going to take the predators significantly longer to rebound from a local pesticide application compared to their pest. And that's why after the application of a pesticide, we oftentimes see a pest spike, because they no longer are able to be kept in check by predators and parasitoids. On this slide right here, I have a screen cap from one of the publications that we recently put out through OSU Extension. This was from our research looking at which native plants are most attractive to bees in our region. Once again, we did the research in the Willamette Valley, but I have with red arrows, I'm noting the plants which are native to the Central Oregon region as well. Not only did we track the number of bees that were associated with each of these wildflowers, but we also counted every insect that could be found on them. And really the only pest that was in numerical abundance were thrips. And one thing that we wanted to note is that even though thrips were super abundant on many of our study plants, their damage was not noticeable. So we would offer, even though they're considered traditionally a pest, if they're not causing damage which is noticeable, we would suggest that there's no need to treat them. Talk a little bit about misidentification as well. You know, when news of the northern giant hornet hit the news because they were spotted at the Canadian-US northern border in and around Bellingham, Washington, there was a lot of hysteria surrounding this particular wasp because they're large, they can be intimidating. And around this time, many beneficial insects, such as the cicada killers, which I have posted over here on the right, were getting mistaken as a northern giant hornet and were being targeted with insecticides. That's one reason why improving insect ID skills can be so important. I do want to note that even though northern giant hornet was spotted in northern Washington for 3 consecutive years, in 2022, there were no new sightings of this insect, which is a really positive outcome thanks to the efforts of the Washington Department of Agriculture. Okay, and I know I'm coming up on time here, so I'm going to introduce you to a few of the bad bugs, which are defined as being bad by me and others because they cause economic and/or ecological harm. And there are 3 that I want to focus on, the bronze birch borer here on the left, the emerald ash borer in the middle, and the lilac root weevil here on the right. And one thing that I want to point out about these particular bad bugs is that oftentimes these insects reach outbreak status or can become problematic because something is out of sync. And oftentimes that thing which is out of sync is that the insects themselves are non-native, such as emerald ash borer or the lilac root weevil, so that they arrive in a new area without their associated complex of predators or parasitoids. Or in the case of bronze birch borer, which is a native insect to our region, it really is only problematic on non-native birch, such as European birch or Asian birch. It does not really reach outbreak status on native birches unless those native birches are stressed. A couple of notes about bronze birch borer, emerald ash borer as well. Affected trees, you'll start to notice symptoms of dieback at the top of the tree canopy. If you have an infested tree, they're oftentimes accompanied with these D-shaped exit holes. Because bronze birch borer is most problematic on non-native European and Asian birches, one thing you can do is take those non-native birches out and instead install a native birch, such as bog birch, water or river birch, or resin birch. And I spent a little time checking the offerings of local native plant nurseries for Central Oregon, and water or river birch, Betula occidentalis, is one that seems to be locally for sale. And then because BBB, bronze birch borer, really only becomes problematic on drought-stressed trees, just making sure that you're taking proper care of these trees to prevent it from being drought-stressed and encouraging the bronze birch borer. Emerald ash borer was only recently discovered in Oregon in June of last year. Dominic Mays, who's an invasive species biologist for the city of Portland, was at their child's soccer game and noticed several ash trees that looked to be in decline. He took a closer look and noticed the distinctive D-shaped exit holes in these trees. And within 48 hours, the identity of emerald ash borer, the first known sightings of this beetle on the West Coast, was made, and the trees were cut down and chipped. This is a little bit concerning because biologists know that it takes generally 2 years for symptoms to occur in the canopy of a tree, such that by the time that the infestation in Forest Grove was discovered, biologists think that it may have been in place for 4 or 5 years. So here are some of the symptoms of emerald ash borers on trees that if you see these symptoms locally, you want to take a closer look. Canopy thinning and crown dieback, suckering at the base of the tree, or woodpecker damage, peckers literally stripping the bark of the tree to get at the larvae underneath. I want to note that emerald ash borer is a real concern because we have a lot of native ash in our riverine areas of Oregon. Ash is also an important historical component of many urban forests, but I have to give a shout out to Oregon's urban foresters. They've been taking steps to locally reduce the abundance of ash as urban street trees because they were anticipating that there might be a time when emerald ash borer would make it out this way. If you're concerned about emerald ash borer, 3 things you can do is learn to identify ash trees and keep an eye on them for any of the signs and symptoms of emerald ash borer. And then if you ever have a suspected infestation, reach out to your local extension office to report it so that we can follow up as needed. I know I'm near the end of time, so I'm going to rush through several of these slides.
Gail, you don't need to rush. You have until 2:30. So.
Oh my God, is that true? I'm sorry. I was really
Yeah.
starting to rush. Thank
No,
you.
no need to do that. You're good.
Okay. So learning to identify ash trees is step 1 to keeping this invasive pest at bay so that you can keep an eye on those particular trees for the signs and symptoms of dieback. Ash trees have really distinctive leafing patterns compound leaves with 5 to 11 leaflets on them, and an opposite branching pattern off of the main stem of the tree. When the trees are mature, they have this gorgeous diamond-shaped pattern on the bark. You see this on mature trees. Young trees have smooth barks that have more wrinkles as the tree gets a little bit older. Depending upon the cultivar of the ash tree that you may be looking at, note that this distinctive diamond shape doesn't show up on all of them. The samaras or seeds of ash trees are also very distinctive, little clusters of these little half helicopter seeds that float as they fall. And then here's the distinctive dieback that Dominic Mays noticed in Forest Grove. You'll also see at the base of this tree that there are suckers coming up due to the stress caused by emerald ash borer feeding. If you happen to see suckering, if you happen to see canopy dieback, take a closer look at that tree and see if you see those distinctive D-shaped exit holes, which are indicative of emerald ash borer presence. If you see vertical cracks or bark splitting, that can be an early sign of infestation. And recognizing the early signs of infestation are particularly important because in invasive species biology, we oftentimes say early detection, rapid response is what helps us fight back insects from spreading. And then the woodpecker damage is very distinctive. These larvae are like little packets of protein feeding within a tree, so that a woodpecker will flake off the bark of the tree to get that nice little protein meal. If you ever see bark flaking or blonding on the tree, that's another clue that you should pause and take a closer look to see if emerald ash borer exit holes are noticeable. Here on the right, I have the finger pointing at this D-shaped exit hole. If you peel back the bark, there are wavy S-shaped tunnels that are very distinctive of emerald ash borer feeding. Just another close-up photo of the D-shaped exit holes and the S-shaped galleries underneath the bark. If you suspect that you see emerald ash borer, you can always reach out to your local extension office. You can also file a report with the Oregon Invasive Species Hotline. Verbal reports without photos or without a specimen are incredibly unhelpful, and especially because folks oftentimes misidentify insects for each other. We actually have a native species of metallic green wood boring beetle that emerald ash borer oftentimes gets confused with. So including photos of the tree, signs, symptoms of the insect, or if you can get a sample of the insect itself, are incredibly useful. It's hard for agencies to react to every report that they get, which is a verbal report alone, because so many of them are false reports of insects of concern. Make sure you take the exact note of your location. And once again, if you have the ability to collect one of the suspected insects, put it in a Tupperware container, put it in the freezer until you can pass it off for confirmation of identification. And then lilac root weevil, also becoming more of a recent concern in and around Central Oregon, whereas the two former insects that I told you about were wood boring beetles inside the stem or trunk of the tree. Lilac root weevil adults feed on the foliage of lilac, privets, and other associated closely related plants. They leave this very characteristic jagged edging on the edge of leaves that they're feeding on. They tend to feed at night, so folks don't see them unless they're going out in the evening with a flashlight. The larvae feed on the roots underneath, so we can get canopy dieback due to the girdling of the roots. If you're looking at recommendations for how to deal with lilac root weevil, there are several pesticide recommendations that you can find online. However, lilacs, privets, and other associated plants are very bee attractive, and you need to be aware of the fact that if you're spraying a tree that's in full bloom, you are going to harm the beneficial insects as well. And then even if you're using a pesticide which is systemic as a root drench, folks have shown that that pesticide can be taken up by the plant, incorporated into the foliage, but also incorporated into the nectar in very low concentrations. Not enough to kill bees, but enough to harm and disrupt their behavior so that you can still have negative effects on the population overall. So this is one of those cases where I suggest that if you have a plant which is particularly prone to pest and you just love it, I know lilacs are beautiful, they have a beautiful fragrance, but if it is prone to this particular pest and you just find that you're not going to win the battle unless you just douse it with pesticides, maybe it's time to look for alternatives. There are several beautiful alternatives that bring other benefits, such as drought-tolerant ceanothus species, a photo of which I have here on the left, or even consider something native like Douglas spirea, which are going to be less prone to insect pest problems, still offer the beauty and the fragrance and draw in the beneficials that you like. And then I say less need for pesticide applications means less work for you. So it's a win all around. Okay, I'm sorry I rushed through that and that I thought that my end time was more at 2 o'clock, but I'm hoping this leaves time for questions. A couple of key points that I want to return to. I hope that I've at least helped you to see that insects are amazing and that there's so much that we can learn about them, so many discoveries to be made about insects in our own backyards and gardens. Through the research that I've been doing on native bees in places like New York and now here in Oregon, we've actually discovered new species that have never been described by science before in people's suburban and urban backyards. So you just have to look, just have to know what you're looking for and recognize that the vast majority of insects are beneficial or neutral to human existence. If you want to build a garden that naturally resists pests, it does include a component of seeking out native plant species and finding a place for them in your garden if you can. It absolutely means pulling back on pesticides and allowing the beneficials to establish so that natural pest control can take effect. Consider that when big pest issues do occur, it's often because of a non-native species problem, either a non-native plant like the European and the Asian birches, which are more prone to bronze birch borer, or because the insects themselves are non-native like emerald ash borer or the lilac root weevil, and they've arrived here without their complex of natural pest controls, the predators and the parasitoids. And then I know that it's a big pain to remove and especially replace big woody plants in the landscape. But I would like to offer that if you find that you're just not winning the fight against a particular pest, maybe it's time to find and seek out other alternatives. And with that, I really do want to thank you for sharing this Earth Day with me, for trying to learn more about insects in the garden and how you can control them with natural controls. I greatly appreciate you being here and I welcome your questions.
Well, first of all, Gail, thank you. Wow, the photographs were amazing, and I'm glued to my computer here. So I know that just I want to get through a couple of there weren't too many questions. I think you did an awesome job explaining things to people, but there were 2 comments that I wanted to share with you. The first one was fur babies always win, so don't worry about the dog. It was like everybody, lots of people understood that completely.
Thank you. I appreciate your understanding.
Well, there are a lot of us who have those fur babies. So, and the other comment was how appreciative we are that you gave so much Central Oregon information, because that is a great help. So I wanted to share those with you. So first up, Monica wanted to know what your opinion is on neem oil and that it's widely used by some gardeners. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so neem oil is not a pesticide that I'm super concerned about in terms of harm to beneficials. It tends to be one of the quote unquote softer pesticides, if you will. The one thing that I would say about neem oil is that when you buy neem oil, hopefully what you're buying is the azadirachtin, the active ingredient, which actually slows insect feeding or deters insect feeding. There are some vendors in the marketplace which are selling neem oil that has been stripped of the active ingredient, the azadirachtin. And so you're just kind of buying like a hort oil, which is less expensive than neem oil. So I would, in terms of harm to beneficials and the ability to manage pests, neem oil is not one I'm super concerned about. I think it's a good approach if you're having a pest issue. It's a good selection. I would just make sure that the neem oil that you're buying actually has the neem active ingredient of azadirachtin in it. Otherwise, you're buying high-priced horticultural oil, which isn't giving you the benefits of the neem, if you will.
Okay, great. So a gal from Terrebonne says that she's surrounded by large properties and ranches that do not have much biodiversity. She's in her second season here, and she's slowly trying to build diversity on her own property with a vegetable garden, some flowers around the house, etc. And this year she wants to add natives, but her question is, will the beneficials find her island of diversity?
Oh, yes, they will. I like to say that gardens are like the biggest field of dreams that there could be. If you build it, they will come. So a lot of our research, my research has been in very urban areas like Portland, even New York City, the South Bronx, East Harlem. And we've shown that gardeners that are putting in habitat in like the most inhospitable of places, like the South Bronx, East Harlem, that if you're switching over to more targeted plantings, which are beneficial to a wider array of species, the insects will find your place. In the studies we've done in Portland, there's a property that was 0.15 acres in size. On 3 sides, it was surrounded by high-rise motels or apartment buildings. It was 2 blocks from the I-5 corridor, 2 blocks from the Max line and like 5 blocks from the I-5 corridor. And it had the second highest level of bee biodiversity of the 24 properties that we were monitoring. And it had as much bee biodiversity on that little urban like drop of property in the middle of Portland than a property that was 40 times its size. And it was because this gardener made specific decisions about what to plant and how to manage those plantings. That's the wonderful thing about insect conservation. You know, it's not the same as like conserving lions or conserving elephants. You don't need a vast tract of land. Insects are mobile. They will find your habitat, and you can make a big difference on even small parcels of land.
Yeah, I love that. If you build it, they will come.
Mhm.
So true. So Jennifer says that a local elementary school put up some bee boxes, but they've been taken over by wasps. She had a wasp problem before the pollinator project, and she wants to know if there's anything she can do to fend off the aggressive wasps without damaging the good bugs.
Yeah, so there are researchers that have shown that most of those bee boxes and bee hotels that are put up should be more aptly named insect hotels, because they don't just provide housing for bees, they tend to provide housing for a lot of insects, most notably wasps. The research that I've seen has shown that the boxes are specifically attractive to an Isodontia species, a grass-carrying wasp that feeds on katydids and crickets, and it kind of like stuffs the cells with like the decapitated remains of crickets and katydids, and then stuffs some grass in there as well. And those tend not to be aggressive towards people. So if you're seeing those bee boxes that have been taken over by wasp, I would absolutely, that aligns with what I know to be true about the biology of that system. But oftentimes those wasps are non-aggressive to humans. If you're having an issue with yellow jackets and other aggressive wasps, I would venture that that may not be directly connected to the bee hotels. If there's a question, you can always ask if you can take like one block of the bee hotel to the extension office and ask the master gardeners to go through them and see what's in there. It is a natural occurrence in our region that the yellow jackets are going to become a problem later in the fall. As things get really toasty in the surrounding habitat, there's not much for yellow jackets to eat. Where they're going to find things to eat are going to be in yards that continue to irrigate. And so there are still plants growing and there are still insects feeding. So I can absolutely see those two things happening, but I'm not sure that they're particularly coupled. They could be, but from what I know about the biology of what happens in those bee hotels, they tend to be non-aggressive wasps that colonize the holes and not the yellow jackets, which have a very different nesting system since they're a eusocial insect that nest in a colony or hive. Those little holes wouldn't provide the habitat that they need to prosper.
Okay. So another participant would like to know, and this is a lilac root weevil question, would nematodes work for that?
Yeah, so nematodes as a control for soil and root feeding insects can work, but nematodes are really, really tricky to get them to work well because you kind of need like the stars and the planets and your zodiac to align. That when you get the nematodes, it has to be at the right time of the year when the larvae are going to be near the surface of the soil. Once they turn into adults, once they pupate into adults, that hard exoskeleton kind of gives like a level of protection against beneficial nematodes. Then when you apply the nematodes at the right time of the year, when the larvae are kind of feeding near the surface, they're not too low, they haven't yet become adults, you need to make sure that those nematodes are given a good and happy habitat. You need to water them in well so that they're not going to dry out, but watering them in well also risks drowning them, if you will. So it's just like they're really temperamental. They're living beings, and yes, they can help with pest control of root feeding insects, but there are so many like things that need to come together to make sure that you get the control that you're looking for.
Okay, thank you. And one last written question, and then we have a couple of live questions from Miss Tony. So hold on to that. Monica would like to know if she needs to worry about earwigs in her garden.
Yeah, earwigs can be a problem. They like to feed on foliage that is very tender. They can oftentimes feed on petals. So, in my garden over here, they can be problematic in like double petaled species. They'll start to brown the petals, which I don't like. I love to grow flowers for beauty. Earwigs, however, you can collect them locally if you put out rolls of corrugated cardboard. Corrugated cardboard has that little like S between the two layers. When I used to work in an entomology lab and we needed to collect thousands of earwigs for experiments, we would put out those corrugated cardboard rolls, leave them out there for like 2-ish days, pick them up and take them back to the lab. I use that same method to control earwigs around my ornamental flowers. I'll put the tubes out where I know that they have high areas of activity and then just pick them up and dispose of them in a plastic bag until they all die. If you use the cardboard roll trick to try to keep your earwig numbers down, The biggest thing is you need to remember to actually pick those rolls up. If you accidentally leave them out there, you're just going to be making your earwig problem worse.
You'll be creating a nursery,
Mhm.
which we don't want. So, Rocky, if you could turn your audio on and have Tony take the camera. Tony said that she has some questions for you.
Hi,
Okay.
Tony.
Hey, so first of all, I want to say thanks for expounding on the negative impacts of purchasing beneficial insects. I was busily writing a question and she's answering it. And so the negative impacts of purchasing beneficial insects as opposed to planting plants that will bring them to your garden. Okay, here is considering the loss in insect numbers, at least in some studied regions. What advice can you give to gardeners as far as garden cleanup, either in winter or spring, to preserve insects in their own garden?
Great question. So, about 3 years ago, we started seeing news headlines about the insect apocalypse, like rapid decreases in the number and biomass of insects. And I think that many of us have noticed that superficially if we just look at the windows on our cars and how they're less covered with insects when we're driving through country roads. And there have been a number of educational outreach pieces saying like, wait to clean up your garden, like don't clean up your garden until it reaches this temperature so that you can protect the insects that are developing within the mulch or within like those less tidy areas. Here's what I suggest. So number one, there's no magic temperature. I can tell you wait until it reaches this point because insects are going to emerge all summer long, all season long. Instead, I suggest doing 2 things. Number one, embrace the untidy, which is easy like for a gardener like me to do because it's less work. If you've ever felt guilty about your gardening skills and that you don't have time to clean up, I'm here to tell you you should actually feel good about that because you're helping conserve insect species. If you do like a more tidy garden, I would suggest to you that you try to designate a couple of areas within your garden, which are going to be places that you're not going to actively manage. You're not going to rake, you're not going to till, you're not going to leaf blow. If possible, hold off on the leaf blowers. I could give a whole nother talk on leaf blowers and why we should look for other alternatives. But even if you do like a more tidy aesthetic, try to see if you can find space for like more naturalistic landscaping where you don't actively tend those areas, and that will provide year-long habitat for insects to persist and thrive.
Thanks, Gail. So you mentioned that aphids don't lay eggs, but they give birth to live young. Can you clarify that statement? Do they ever lay eggs?
Do aphids ever lay eggs?
Like in the fall?
Do they lay eggs in the fall?
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, they lay eggs in the fall. Thank you, Tony.
Okay. Thanks. I'm going, oh my gosh. I think we need clarification. Thank you, Gail.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. But in the spring, that is oftentimes where we have our best opportunity to kind of keep them at bay. But that's also where they can rapidly increase because they're reproducing asexually through parthenogenesis or just like live birth of young.
Indeed. Indeed. Thanks, Gail. I appreciate your talk and very cool.
Thanks, Tony.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Gail, this has been amazing. And again, thank you so much. I was never really a bug person until I took the Master Gardener training. And then, of course, I have Tony, who's like the quintessential bug lady that locally, and we love her. So I'm going to share my screen here real quick for all of our attendees who are still on. Thank you again so much to our participants for coming on this beautiful April day, this Earth Day, to join us. And as I indicated at the beginning, there will be a recording of our webinar available. It'll be emailed to you sometime next week. And when you sign off, there is a short survey, and please fill that out because we really go to great lengths to try and design these webinars so that they really address our gardening community's needs and we address subjects that you really want to hear about. And the only way for us to do that is for you to help us by completing the survey. So with that said, I would like to thank Gail again for such an amazing, she makes bugs actually interesting, which is amazing. Gotta love that. So thank you,
Gail.
everybody. She does. I mean, it could be a really boring, horrible topic, but she manages to make it not only interesting, but fun and funny. And who can describe a bug that's a gorgeous bug? Look at those, and the spider's eyes. It is wonderful. So with that, everyone, this closes out our 2023 spring webinar series. And for those of you who have participated in all 8 of them, thank you. Thank you. We love you. And with that, I am going to bid you adieu, and I'm going to close our webinar. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend.
Bye.
Bye, Gail.